Hallelujah. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. On the Sabbath, Jesus went through the grain fields. His disciples were hungry and they began to pluck heads of grains and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Lord, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Jesus said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? They entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." The Gospel of the Lord. We are beginning our reflections on Matthew chapter 12 today. And Matthew chapter 12, Jesus identifies himself as the new center of worship. He says, something greater than the temple is here. And number two, he says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. You see, in the cultic life of the Jewish people, Sabbath and the temple are central. That is when we're talking about the cult of worship for the Jewish people. They are inviolable. The Sabbath was sacrosanct, flowing from Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, where God declared Sabbath. After he had created heaven and earth, he has created everything, he rested on the Sabbath. So for them, Sabbath was inviolable. And so Jesus and his disciples were traveling through a corn farm. And the disciples were hungry. And they began to pluck the grains and to eat the grains. And then the Pharisees, remember the Pharisees, these were experts in the law, the holy of holy guys. They saw them, our text says they saw them. And they said to Jesus, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." In other words, they are talking about commandment number 4. Remember to keep the Sabbath day holy. So the question here is threefold. Number one, what was this accusation about? Was it that the disciples, in plucking the grains, were they walking on the Sabbath? Does that amount to walking on the Sabbath? Were they performing work? And number two, was it that they were plucking the grains and eating the grains without having washed their hands? And so Jesus challenged the Pharisees, and he says, your interpretation of the Sabbath is not in the Torah. It's not in the law. It's man-made, which is called the tradition of the elders. And Jesus always tells the Pharisees, he always tells them that, look, you guys are following human tradition. Follow scripture, not the tradition of the elders. And so Jesus went to the Old Testament and quoted from 1 Samuel chapter 31. He says, have you not read what David did when he and his companions ate the bread of the presence? Now, if you read 1 Samuel chapter 31, David was running away from King Saul, who wanted to kill him. So he had some bodyguards around him. And so they were fleeing from King Saul. And then they became hungry, and they came to a town called Nob. And they went in. There was a tabernacle there, just like the present day kind of tabernacle. Now, if you read the book of Leviticus, after the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea, and they started to worship Yahweh, they always kept 12 loaves of bread in the tabernacle, which were refreshed every Sabbath day. It was called the showbread, or the bread of the presence. And these 12 loaves of bread reminds the people what God did. Two things. It reminds the people of how God fed them with manna from heaven for 40 years. They didn't have to farm. They were traveling for 40 years, and God kept raining down bread from heaven. And they were never to forget what God did with the showbread. And so every Sabbath day, the 12 loaves of bread were displayed for worship, to remember what God did, how it's called bread from heaven. Our text calls it bread of the presence of God. And so some of the manna from heaven, they saved some of the manna from heaven, some of that bread, and when they were building the temple, they buried some of those particles of the bread from heaven under the temple. That's why they consider the temple a very holy place. And so Jesus tells them that something greater than the temple is here. The bread that was buried under the temple was not the real bread. The real bread is standing right here. Jesus is the bread from heaven come down. And so he says something greater than the temple is here. So the question we ask in Bible study is, why did Jesus make reference to David eating the bread? Since he was not a priest, only the priest was allowed to eat that bread. And he says, why did Jesus make reference to King David doing what is not lawful? He's simply saying David did what was not lawful, and you Pharisees see him as a hero. You did not condemn David, but he did something that was not lawful. And the disciples who are participating in the mission of Christ as Messiah, who is the new bread for the world, you condemning him and his disciples. And he says, that's your hypocrisy. And then he says again, have you not read in the Torah how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath? Now, what is it talking about? Because according to the interpretation of the Pharisees on commandment number 4, keep the Sabbath day holy, is that no work should be done. And so Jesus says, but the priests in the temple are conducting worship on the Sabbath. They're killing rams and making sacrifice. Is that not work? Why are you not condemning these priests who are working on the Sabbath in the name of doing their duty? And he says your interpretation of commandment number 4 to keep the Sabbath day holy, it's wrong. And so Jesus Christ then says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And he says they should go and learn what that means. And then he now declared himself. He says he is Lord of the Sabbath. In other words, Jesus declared himself as the new temple who will be worshipped on the Sabbath. And that is what happened when eventually Jesus gets to Jerusalem. Our text says he was traveling through the grain field. Every time you see Jesus traveling, he was moving towards Jerusalem. And what will happen in Jerusalem? Jesus comes to replace the temple. And people went to the temple every Sabbath. Jesus, as the new temple, will be worshipped on the Sabbath, on the day of the Lord, which is called the day the sun rose from the dead. So Jesus sort of gives a premonition of what is going to happen when he says something greater than the temple is here. So Jesus is greater than the temple. The temple was just a building upon which some particles of manna was buried under the temple. That's why it's called holy, because something from heaven is in that temple. So they call it Holy of Holies, because bread from heaven were preserved and buried under the temple. So if you wanted to meet God, you needed to go to Jerusalem. You needed to touch your feet on the grounds of Zion. And Jesus Christ says, he is greater than the temple. He is the bread of life. He is the bread that came down from heaven. and he is the Lord of the Sabbath. In other words, when, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, God himself created the Sabbath. And whenever God speaks about the Sabbath, he calls it my day, the day of the Lord. That's what it is. If you read Exodus chapter 31, Sabbath is called my Sabbath. God says my Sabbath. It's my day. That is the day God says, give that day to me. So for Jesus to say that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath makes himself equal with God. To say, on that day, people will worship me, Jesus. And that is what the Sabbath has become. And so Jesus, in Matthew chapter 12, declared those two things, which are central. He comes to replace those two things that are central to the Jewish cultic life: the temple and the Sabbath.